I've had at least 3 of you ask me how to make sculpting tools on here, so I figured I'd show you how to make one of my favorites. So this is a loop tool. It's used mostly for removing, shaping, and blending clay. It's a really simple tool to make. There's just a few things that I'd like to mention as how I make them. And you can apply this to many different types of tools, just like I have here. These are all variations of that type of tool, and I'll go into detail and explain a little bit more about these as I'm going along here. So the first thing you're gonna need is one of these brass tubes. These come in all different lengths and sizes. The company that puts this out is called K&S Metals. There's a website right here. I'll leave a link down below. And they make supplies for hobbyists and miniature artists and sculptors and crafters and stuff like that. For this particular tool, we're using number 5127. This is a 1/8 inch brass tube, and this comes in a set of 3. As you can see, I picked it up at Hobby Lobby, $3.99. Use a coupon. If you don't have a Hobby Lobby near you, most big box hardware stores carry them, like Lowe's and Home Depot. Any mom and pop hobby shop will have one. Art supply stores, just look around. They're not too tough to find. I would pick up a bunch of different sizes to experiment with. What you're gonna need is something to cut this with, and that same company, K&S, also makes a little tube cutter. Usually the same place that sells these tubes will sell one of these as well. I think they're like $6 or $7, and I know Hobby Lobby carries them too. They're really handy to have, and I use them, you know, to cut stuff like this all the time. All it does is just cut it really accurately and quickly with minimal cleanup. If you can't find one of these little tubing cutters, or you wanna save money or whatever, another quick, easy way to do this is to just take one of these hobby knife blades, and all you'd have to do is put it down on the table here like this, measure where you want to cut, and then you just roll it back and forth while pressing down. Again, this is brass, so this is a soft metal, and it's soft enough that you'll eventually cut right through this, and then you can just clean it up the inside, or you just take a file or some sandpaper and you clean up the edge and, you know, make it nice and pretty. I usually like to make these at exactly 6 inches. I just find that's a good size between how far it fits in my hand and between the board and the sculpt, and it's not too big of a tool. You know, I do have, like I said, different variations. Just to be able to reach between the board and the sculpt, sometimes you might want a smaller length, and this is actually a whole different type of tool that I'll explain in a second too. Most of the time, I don't usually go over 6 inches with these. They all measure about the same. So what you do is take your tube, measure it to whatever length that you want. This one, I'm gonna copy this exactly here. So I've measured this tube out at 6 inches. There's a little notch here that I put with the knife, and I'm just gonna take this tubing cutter and tighten the knob here. And if you've never used one of these before, all this is just, you're just gonna tighten the knob a little bit. You can see this little wheel in here. It's a little sharp wheel. And what you're gonna do is, as you tighten this knob and turn around this tube, it's just gonna keep scoring the tube deeper and deeper as you tighten this, and then eventually it'll just cut off. And I've had this tubing cutter for years, so it's kind of dull actually. Okay. So now we have our length of tube, and I don't know if you'll be able to see, there's a little edge that's left on this, and I'll just take it and clean it up real quick. First the inside with the little knife, and it's soft enough, again, the metal is soft enough to cut. And then I'm gonna quickly sand or file off this little burr that's left on the end here. Now that we have a nice clean edge, and this is the factory edge, so we know that's clean. The tip of this tool is actually made from a guitar string. There's different sizes on each end, and the reason for that is because guitar strings are made, they have a metal wire on the inside, and then there's metal wire that's wound around that wire, and it has these nice little teeth, or these little grooves. And so that when you're using this on the clay, the teeth will help to kind of rake down and blend in and amalgamate any of the forms that you're trying to work on. So what you want to do is head over to your local guitar center, and don't scratch the Trans Am that's parked out front. I got a bunch of different sizes here. These are really cheap, so I would recommend picking up a bunch of them. But the sizes that I have that I use the most, so I have 26, 36, 42, and 52 gauge. You could pick some up that are larger than this, but for me personally, I found that I haven't needed to go much larger than that yet. So you can see the comparison. This is the largest, this is a 52 gauge, and this is the smallest that I have, which is a 26. So it's a subtle difference, but it does make a difference. You'll notice it a lot more when you're working on a piece. For this tool, I actually have a 26 on one side, and then a 36 on the other side. So one side is slightly thicker than the other, and I find that this is a good step between each. When you're using these types of tools, it's almost like the grit of sandpaper. You'd start with something a lot more harsh than this, or something that has teeth like this, for instance, and this is made of a tiny jeweler's saw blade. And then you'd work your way down finer and finer, but this is kind of a good middle of the road tool that you'd use after you just started blending a little bit with your thumb, or you just got to get into a little fine area that you can't reach with your fingers. But I don't want to get into sculpting technique too much in this video. I just want to show you how you can kind of make a quick set of tools for yourself to get started. If you are looking for really in-depth sculpting tutorials, click the link in the description and check out my Gumroad page. Now for the next part, there's a bunch of different ways you could do this, and I'm just going to touch upon some of the ways. This is just how I do it. First up, we have, these are little mandrels put out by a company called Bead Buddy, and I just picked these up at the craft store. And as you can see, they're all, you know, different sizes here, and they have steps down. I don't really use these too often. I just picked them up because they were on clearance, so they were like $2 or something. But they can be useful to help bend shapes. You also have these round needle nose pliers, and you have needle nose pliers that have steps. I would just recommend going to a craft store and just taking a look at their beading section or their jewelry sections. Usually a lot of the time they'll have stuff that's really useful to making tools and doing little fine work like this. Then another thing I have here is a board, and I've just sunk some screws and nails into it, nailed in some different shapes and sizes, and all this is just to be able to give the wire a form to bend around. So I'll take these two out here. And that's what I have left. I've made a bunch of tools with this stuff already, so you get more than this when you buy a guitar string, but this is just what I have left. Next up, you want to take whatever form that you're going to be using, whether it be this board with some screws or pins put into it, or these pliers or whatever. The reason I'm using the board is because you can do this with hardened steel wire as well, which I'll cover in another tutorial at some point, I'm sure, if you're just making a regular loop tool. But for this guitar wire, you just want to be really careful of these little teeth here that you don't mar them. If I was to try to bend this around with some pliers, because I'm squeezing both sides at once, it might mark up the teeth and flatten them, and then the tool's not really going to be as useful as it should be. So I have a couple of different common sizes marked here. First thing I do is usually take this board and I'll just take a quick clamp and then clamp it to a table or a bench or whatever, or just have a friend hold it. If you ain't got no friends, I don't know what to tell you. Just as an example, what you want to do is just make sure that you leave enough wire that you have a little bit of extra and you can crimp so that the wire will hold inside of the tube. And then, you know, take into consideration where you're going to bend it. So bend this right around. And for this tool, what I like to do, see how I pulled it all the way around itself like that? Because I want this tip to flare out a little bit, so that just kind of allows greater reach instead of just having a normal loop, which that could also be a useful tool as well, but I find that I use these a lot more. So next up, you need something to trim the wire with. So I have some just little cheap wire nippers here. A lot of the times, if you have needle nose pliers, they'll have little nippers in the inside as well too. And to be honest, if you have a cheap pair of scissors laying around, you could just use that to cut this as well. But for this, I'm just going to use my wire cutters. Next, we're going to take the tube that we've already trimmed and take the bent wire and just stick it down in there. You want these tools to be kind of stiff. If I were to leave this out here, it wouldn't work very well because it'd be too flexible and you need a little bit of stiffness to work the clay. This one here I've created for me is basically perfect, so I'm gonna make it about this size. Now, next thing you want to do is crimp the wire inside of the tube. So I have these. I apologize, I don't know the brand name. They're just very cheap, no-name brand crimpers. I picked these up at Lowe's. They're usually about $20. I do remember getting these on clearance. They were like $5, so just look around. I'm sure you can probably find some on eBay, maybe a flea market or something. You don't need these. They're more for larger tools, but you can grab these. This is by a company called Beadalon. You can get these at Michael's, AC Moore, Joann Fabrics, any kind of like big box craft store. I think Walmart might even have them in the craft section. I haven't checked though, but what these are is just little, they've got these little teeth in here, and all you do is squeeze them together and crimp the wire inside of the tube. Take the tool and make any kind of final adjustments that you have. All right, this looks pretty good to me. Now, one thing you want to note is that the ends of the guitar string here, You don't want those to overlap, okay? You want them to just stay straight on either side. So that way you get a nice tight crimp all the way down and it holds well. This is the trickiest part of this. I like to get a nice neat crimp just because I like my tools to look nice and not super ghetto. What I'm gonna do is just take my crimper and then just do this part slowly. I know it might be tough to see on camera, but just give it a little squeeze and then move down a little bit. And this is actually a lot easier to do when you're not filming yourself, trying to keep this in focus here. So we're gonna keep going and keep working our way. And once I'm confident that the strings aren't crossed, make sure that the tip doesn't want to spring out on you. And you don't want to overdo this either, because you can crack the brass because it's a soft metal. So it's not going to be the strongest tool that you make, but I've had my set for years and years, and I honestly can't remember ever breaking one of these types of tools, so they should last you a really long time if you use them with care. The difference between a crimper, like I was saying before, you could just use flat needle nose pliers and squeeze it and it would hold just fine, but this way it looks a little bit neater, so you get this nice little divot inside here and it will hold the string a little better. And then depending on what size tube you use, there's really small teeth in here as well, so you could do something that's like, this is one of the smallest ones that I have, and you can see just how small of a crimp you can get in there. All right, so now we have our crimp. If you wanted to, you could go in and clean this up with a little bit of sandpaper and then polish it back. You can see these little teeth marks. I try to avoid these, but since it's on camera, it's just a demonstration. So take your time and get a nice clean crimp. Next up, if you want to, which I usually do, like I said, you want to be careful you don't mar the teeth on this, but I'll take some of these pliers and just kind of stick them in the inside, because the inside of this usually never really touches the clay. Give it a little bit of a stretch and you can kind of shape it a little bit just to get it to bow out a little bit more. Really get a nice round edge here. Now we're going to take our fine guitar string, and one thing to note, I mean, I have this little piece left here, but when you start off with a fresh string and you open it up, don't just bend it right in the middle in case you mess up. You want to use the stock intelligently so you don't just waste it. I'm going to take this little small piece and do the same thing with it. And again, we're going to bend all the way around like that. Pull it tight, cut the ends off. Take our tool and then feed the string into the end here. Okay. And I'm going to use this other one as a guide. Let me just get you a measurement on this real quick in case you want to try to duplicate this exactly. So we're just about at 3/8 of an inch here, just to give you an idea. Once I'm happy with this, we're going to hold it in place. And this time I'm going to take my larger crimp tool just to get it started and just kind of flatten this tube a little bit. Okay, I'll take our other crimpers and crimp it. And again, I'm going to take my little needle nose pliers here and just open this up. What I like to do for one final step with this, take the tool, stick it flat on the table, hold the tip down, and then give it a nice little bend upwards. What that does is just help give it a lot more reach and just make it a little bit more useful when you're using it on a sculpt. And this is, I have it bent right now at almost about 45 degrees. Every so often when it flattens out, I just bend it right back. So this stuff is pretty malleable. They're quick to make too anyway, so if it does break, no worries. One more thing I like to do that I forgot to mention is that try to make each side as perfectly opposite as you can, so that when you're sculpting, you can just flip it around and continue working without it being all twisted or weird. So real quick, as I was mentioning before, these tubes come in all different sizes. This is just epoxy putty that I put on here. It's just to help strengthen and stiffen the little tips. You don't need to do this, but all I did was just take some 2-part epoxy putty or plumber's putty. You can pick that stuff up at the hardware store, and then smush it on there, clean it up, sand it down, and just make it nice and clean. Most of the time now, I just crimp these. I don't bother with all this. Now, as far as the shapes, I just try to think of shapes that are useful. This is another one of my favorite tools actually right here. It's got this little hooked edge and a little corner. You can get into a lot of different areas with this. If you were gonna make another one, I'd definitely recommend one just like this. This is a really awesome tool as well, and you can see it's, instead of the brass tube, it's aluminum. So it's not quite as strong, but it's really super light. If I hold this thing in my hand, it's almost like holding nothing. This, instead of guitar wire, I've used jeweler's saw blades. Those are kind of a pain in the butt to work with because you have to heat them up in order to bend them, and they have a tendency to snap and they have a tendency to break too, but this one's still hanging in there. I've had this for a while. And then I did the same kind of thing here with some thicker guitar string. Again, this is just epoxy, and I just kind of made a neat little handle, and this is just a little like stud stubby tool. So if you need to get real close to something, or usually like under the chin or in between hair and the face, it's good to have little tools like this that can reach in where the longer tools can't. I have a larger version of this as well too. Same thing with the shape on this. You can see it's flat there, so you can kind of rake with all sides and a little fine corner to get in as well. Then I have these really small tools. This one, I sell this one sometimes. When I have time to make tools, I put them up in my web store, sculpturegeekhq.com/shop. I'll leave a link down below. Sometimes I stock them, sometimes I don't. It's just whenever I have time or whatever. If I have extra stock laying around, I feel like making some tools, I make them and throw them up for sale. Then we have these. These are made in a slightly different way. Because I wanted the ends to be so small, I used a smaller diameter tube and then just inserted that into the next step up tube, and it's glued in, and then of course it's crimped as well where the tip is. And then these are just really useful shapes that I have. This again is a jeweler saw blade. It's really fine teeth. And then this guy here, these are really good for things like skin wrinkles and stuff like that. I use this a lot on the Baraka sculpt I just finished up. Check that out if you haven't seen it already. This is another smaller tool that I have. It's just a basic shape, and 2 different grit jeweler saw blades on this as well. And then you can do the same type of thing where you have detailing tools, texturing tools, just like this. It's made the same way with this hardened steel wire, and then you just stick that in there, crimp it together, and then you can bend these however you want. You can keep them straight, whatever. And then when you drag this across the surface, it makes little skin wrinkles like this. Just blend those in, you're good to go. And that's gonna do it. Now get to work.